Welcome to Alaska Weather, a production of Alaska Public Media and the National Weather Service, Alaska Region. Produced and broadcast daily from the studios of KAKM, Alaska Weather provides complete forecasts, public, marine, and aviation for all of Alaska. Alaska Weather is made possible by the following sponsors.
The National Weather Service.
Good evening, everyone. I'm meteorologist Dave Snider with the National Weather Service. It's the 8th of November, and as always, we encourage you to stay up to date with your local weather information, both today and going into the weekend, especially if you're in northern Alaska. Weather conditions will be changing there quickly, and as you head into southeastern Alaska, going into Friday and Saturday, weather will be changing for you as well. South Central, we'll see what we get here in just a minute. As always, you can check the Alaska Weather Information line at 1-800-472-0391. Weather.gov/Alaska is your online portal to find information anytime you want, and a quick click or two will get you to the Alaska Aviation Weather Unit, the Alaska Pacific River Forecast Center, of course the National Tsunami Warning Center, and any of the forecast offices around Alaska. Any questions you have anytime about stuff you can find or cannot find, please let me know. I'm happy to help. david.snyder@noaa.gov is my email. Feel free to use it. Here's a look at the watches, warnings, and advisories around Alaska. Now, the current situation where weather is coming down hard and heavy in the form of snow. We have winter storm warnings here across the Kobuk and Noatak valleys there, and the latest forecast includes amounts that could bring snowfall totals up to about 15 inches on the higher side. Most places are probably looking at about 8 to 12 inches of snow in this range, and all across the interior of the Seward Peninsula and the eastern end of Norton Sound and toward Galvin. Now, many areas, though, are also going to be looking at some strong winds, and for the higher terrain, that means blowing snow and poor visibility, and that's what you see here across most of the Brooks Range. There will be additional snowfall here across the south-facing slopes of the Brooks Range with a southerly flow that's really going to impact those south-facing slopes a little bit more. But you also have wind impacts on the water, and those coastal flood advisories continue for areas north of the Yukon River and out across the western end of the Seward Peninsula. We also have some high surf advisories that continue through this evening. But you'll also notice the orange color up here around Barrow and all the way into the Kotzebue Sound region and north of Cape Krusenstern. Those are coastal flood watches, and that's for the next wave of weather that's coming. So what we have plotted here tonight are what's actively going on and what is also coming in the next day or so as we head in toward the weekend. We also are looking at another surge of wind, water, and likely snow as we get into the weekend and probably through Sunday and into early Monday. So a lot going on. It has been a busy winter weather week for many of you up north and in the West Coast, and it looks like that's going to continue through the weekend. So don't go to sleep on the watch just yet, because it looks like things will continue to be pretty busy for you. And again, make sure you're keeping eyes on the coastal forecast as we go ahead. Here's a look at the satellite picture now. We have one wave of weather that's working through the central and eastern interior there, and we still have our low pressure system across the eastern Gulf. As you look down to the south, you can see another wave of low pressure there, and what you don't see really clearly just yet is the next one that's coming in for next weekend. We'll get to that in just a minute. For right now, we're seeing this onshore westerly push coming into areas north of the Yukon, Norton Sound, the Seward Peninsula and Kotzebue Sound, and riding up the Chukchi Coast. Conditions are also a little rough out here across the Beaufort Seacoast, but one thing is working in your favor there, and that is continued growth of the sea ice there, which we're not seeing in the Chukchi at the moment, thanks to the wind. As you look across South Central, you notice generally clear and dry conditions, breezy at times across the Alaska Peninsula and across Southeast, but generally speaking, conditions are dry and fair for many there. And out across the west, the next wave of weather is working in from west to east, and once again, you can pick out that kind of mackerel sky texture there in the central and western part of the Bering Sea. That's indicative of cold air aloft, so it's telling us that the storm probably has some storm energy to work with a little bit of additional cold. Today's weather map has a surface front moving across the north and western areas and periods of heavy snow seen all the way from the south-facing slopes of the eastern Brooks Range all the way back through Ambler and Bettles and into the Kobuk and Noatak Valley there. Low pressure just west of the Pribilofs at 1,010 millibars. We've got another wave just off the shore of eastern Russia, and low pressure sitting here across the eastern Gulf. This is backing away, and this is moving from west to east. As we get into tonight, the main circulation in town will be just east of Kotzebue at 998 millibars, working for Ambler and heading for Bettles there. Pressure gradient is still pretty tight. That means we've got a lot of wind working across the northern Bering, and a lot of wind means it's moving a lot of water. This coming in from a west to northwesterly trajectory is going to affect Norton Sound and Kotzebue Sound and many along the Seward Peninsula and the Chukchi Coast, with additional pushes of water there. So again, not the best of situations for those that don't have ice in place just yet. Up north, there will be areas of blowing snow for the Beaufort Seacoast, generally east and along the coast from Barrow. You can see that warmer air working up there, so blustery conditions west of the Dalton as well. High pressure is getting out of the way. Conditions fairly clear, but beginning to show a little bit of a tightening pressure gradient across the Gulf. And out across the west, you can barely see the signs of the next weather maker creeping eastward. That is going to be a surge of warmer air working up across the western Bering, with high pressure sitting at 1,037 millibars across the central chain. By Thursday, low pressure is dropping into the Gulf. This was the system that was up here around Ambler and Bettles. As that quickly moves through, there's a possibility of a light amount of snow across south central. For southeast, the pressure gradient will start to tighten up a little bit more, and you'll start to see the effects of this weather perhaps as early as Friday. Watch for periods of rain, snow, and mixed precipitation across the Bristol Bay region all the way through the Alaska Peninsula. And periods of heavy snow may continue up around the Kobuk and Noatak valleys there, including areas around the eastern Norton Sound with blowing snow possible inland, and periods of rain and snow closer to the coast along St. Lawrence Island as well. This wave will likely bring additional snowfall to the Fairbanks area and surrounding regions. But the thing to watch will be the blizzard conditions across some of the highway passes there around the Steese and Elliott Parks, all those, all looking at the possibility of very poor winter conditions up at the top of those passes there. Down low, probably not as bad, but something to keep in mind as you get into the weekend here. For Friday, notice many areas looking at snow across the interior, but the next surge will really start to develop as we get into Friday. Watch for periods of rain and snow to mix around the Yukon Delta and northward into Norton Sound and the Seward Peninsula. And notice again that pressure gradient up across the top is still pretty tight. That means we're going to have a lot of wind working through the region here and keeping visibilities fairly poor. Let's turn our attention to southeast momentarily, and you'll notice at 1,002 millibars, the storm parked right offshore will have a decent opportunity to sling some moisture right up into the central and southern parts of the Panhandle, where at best you'll get rain. At worst, you'll probably have a mixture all the way up toward about Sitka or so. And then north of that, it looks like it's going to bring in snow, and probably the first accumulating snow for Juneau. So don't be surprised to see some minor accumulations with that, all the way up to Yakutat. And again, the pressure gradient tightening up for you means the situation is going to be breezy at best as we get into Friday and probably Saturday for all of our favorite places, especially up and down the Lynn Canal. Out across the west, you can see the colder air coming in behind the weather maker there at 994 millibars. That is going to be a slow process getting from here on Friday to Saturday and then on into Sunday and Monday. So this will be a storm that just keeps on giving as we go into Friday and the rest of the weekend. So you'll want to continue to watch Alaska Weather and make sure you're checking up on the very latest weather information from your emergency management areas and, of course, your village authorities there. Let's take a look at temperatures as we get into Thursday morning. It's going to be cold and dry across many parts of the eastern interior, but notice the change happening up the lower terrain. 20s and 30s there for the Yukon and Kuskokwim deltas and the valleys there. 24 around Nome, 18 in Barrow, 20s to low 30s around most of southeast. South central also cold. Mid-teens around Talkeetna, teens and 20s for Prince William Sound, 20 in Kenai, and 30s and 40s for the west and southwestern coastline, including Kodiak. A high of 42 expected on Thursday for southeast, 30s and 40s for many. Across the eastern interior, highs only in the teens and 20s. Fairbanks 25, south central in the upper 20s to low 30s. The upper Yukon, upper Kuskokwim, and middle Yukon, all looking at temps at or even above freezing in many locations, with a westerly wind moving a lot of wet air in. 28 in Nome, 33 around Gamble and Savunga, Kotzebue 26, 25 in Barrow. As you look at Friday morning, again, still pretty cold stuff and dry air in place for Fort Yukon, Arctic Village. Fairbanks still chilly, but not as cold as it has been. 13 there, 8 around Eagle. South Central in the teens and 20s, 32 in Kodiak, 20s and 30s for Southeast, and low to mid-20s for many across the West Coast. St. Paul showing 39. As we get into Friday, as that storm is starting to move in slowly and surely out west, you can start to see that warm and wet air creeping in. 38 in Savunga, 42 in St. Paul, 41 in Nunivak Island, and Macquarie in lower 40s around the Alaska Peninsula all the way out toward the chain. The warm air stops though as you get into south central and the interior. We're still looking at single digits and low to mid-teens, even a few 20s there for Friday afternoon. Southeast, though, warming up, and many areas there will be in the upper 20s to low 30s north of Juneau, 30s and 40s to the south, supporting a better chance for rainfall as you head into your Friday and into the weekend.
And now, aviation weather around Alaska.
Moving on to flying weather now, IFR conditions are expected across the western Alaska Range, parts of the Tanana Valley, and the south-facing slopes of the Brooks Range. Most areas in southeast through the Copper River Valley and a large part of south central and Prince William Sound should be okay on Thursday morning. Out to the west, though, we'll see changes along the west coast through the Aleutians and across the Chukchi Coast and Kotzebue Sound as the next wave of weather moves ashore. You can start to see hints of that here by Thursday afternoon with IFR pushing into the Kobuk and Noatak Valleys and the Chukchi Coast. Also across the south-facing slopes of the Brooks Range a little bit further east and into the central and eastern interior. The western Alaska Range sees a little bit of improvement. Still looking pretty good for southeast on Thursday afternoon, and out west, the YK Delta is looking at generally MVFR conditions with hit-and-miss IFR across the western Bering and the western chain. As we get into Friday morning, IFR is spotty across the Alaska Range. Areas up around the central and eastern Tanana Valley and the upper valley there in the Yukon Flats, and once again the Brooks Range as well as the Kobuk and Noatak Valleys, and north and west of St. Matthew. MVFR is moving into the outer coast of southeast as well, and still seems to be missing a large part of Prince William Sound and south central, including Kodiak Island. By Friday afternoon, IFR though is developing across some of the higher terrain of southeast. MVFR for just about all of the inside passages there in the outer coast. IFR is also going to be found around Prince William Sound and inland a little bit more into the Copper River Valley. IFR is developing across the interior and lingering across the western and northwestern coastlines in the Kobuk and Noatak Valley there as that wave of weather is still working through. Watch for IFR as well through St. Lawrence Island, Yukon Delta, and probably to about Bethel and west, and also west of St. Matthew. Here are your pass conditions then for tomorrow. AKwx Pass, we expect to see IFR conditions lingering in the region, probably a little lean over toward MVFR as we go throughout the day. Same goes for Adigan Pass. We expect to see marginal conditions developing by the afternoon, the worst of it passing through in the morning. Lake Clark and Merrill Pass, though, probably not as lucky. IFR conditions are expected to linger there all of Thursday. Same goes for Rainy Pass. Instrument flight rule should linger throughout the day. Windy Pass, we expect to see marginal conditions through most of your Thursday, and Isabel Pass, MVFR is expected through Thursday all day long. Mentasta Pass at this point, just like today, is expected to hold around VFR conditions through most of your Thursday. Probably won't see changes there until we head into the weekend. Tenita Pass, we expect to see VFR through MVFR by the afternoon. Portage Pass also seeing some similar transitions there. Remember, we didn't see a whole lot on the map around Prince William Sound at all until Friday, so watch for some changes later in the week. And Chilkoot and White Pass expected to hold at VFR. Freezing levels indicate the cold is just kind of stopped right here around Nunivak Island for now. In this westerly pattern, this probably won't see any huge fluctuations until we get into perhaps later on in the weekend and early next week. In the meantime, 2 to about 6,000 foot levels there across southeast, a surface freezing line just south of Homer. Kodiak Island hovering around 2,000 foot freezing levels there just to your east. And then again, most areas in Alaska are below that 2,000 foot freezing line in the morning tomorrow. Icing potential is a little bit higher up there, 4 to about 6,000 feet across southwest and south central. Southeast, not a very great risk at all right now for any icing potential. And for the Yukon Valley and north, generally above 2,000 feet there for at least some isolated moderate. And the next wave is developing here across eastern Asia, moving across the central and northern Bering Sea. You can see that is generally above 8,000 feet, though, thanks to that stiff southerly wind. The jet stream right now has a ridge of high pressure across the west. The southerlies building behind that at 115 knots represent the next wave that's working our way. Northwesterlies are already working across the west coast at 130 knots, and southwesterlies moving across southeast. So we have a very active pattern here, and a general westerly flow below that at 9,000 feet. You can see the winds between 40 and 45 knots, even 50 knots coming ashore into Norton Sound, and really not too far off that for Kotzebue Sound and places like Shishmaref and Kotzebue themselves. They're looking at that strong push of weather coming in with that. Across the interior, 20 to 35 knots, and for southeast, 10 to 20 knots there. Most areas looking at mostly a west wind. At 3,000 feet, wind speeds coming into the North Slope are ranging in from the west about 20 knots or so. Westerlies coming into Norton Sound and the YK Delta around 30 to 35. High pressure sitting south of the chain. That's guiding in some stronger winds out across the western chain, 60 to 75 knots. And for the Gulf, you're looking at 15 to 25 knots in all areas. Turbulence, then, we're really going to focus on areas up north and west in the next several days. Below 4,000 feet right now with considerable moderate all the way from Nome and inland to about Ambler and Bettle, southward toward Bristol Bay, including Bethel and most of the central and eastern Aleutians below 4,000 feet. We'll be back with a look at your marine weather and sea ice edge here in just a few minutes. Stay tuned. Welcome to another edition of Alaska Weather Facts. I'm meteorologist Dave Snider, and joining us once again is our good friend Eric Stevens from GINA, the Geographic Information Network of Alaska. Thanks again for joining us, Eric. We really appreciate it, as always.
Happy to be here, Dave.
Thanks. And, you know, we're going to ask you some more satellite questions here, but, you know,
Okay.
Since you're a regular guest, we're going to give you a riddle this time, kind of a trick start to the show.
Okay.
How do you see a polar bear in a snowstorm?
Sounds like a challenging question because
Okay.
the polar bear is white and the snowstorm's white.
Yeah.
How do you do that? Well, in the world of satellite meteorology, you couldn't, because the spatial resolution of this instrument that we're going to talk about today has 375 meters resolution, and even the most well-fed polar bear will not be 375 meters across.
I'm okay with that.
Yeah, you wouldn't want to run into such a
No, that'd be a
creature,
bad day.
would you? In the satellite meteorology world, the equivalent would be, how do you tell the difference between clouds and then an area that has no clouds but's covered by snow,
Right.
a piece of ocean that has no clouds but has sea ice?
Ah.
All three of these are white. The
Right.
snow, the clouds, the sea ice, it's all white. So how, using satellite data, can you tell someone where the clouds are and where the clear areas are? This is important for aviators. Mariners want to know, in the ocean there, this white stuff, is that sea ice or is that just a cloud?
Right.
How do we tell the difference? And it turns out, if you look, say, at a picture of Alaska from the springtime, March or April, and it's high noon, so we're getting a lot of sunshine. If you were riding on a satellite with your human eye, look down, everything's white.
Right.
And we've got a picture of Alaska from early April, and we're seeing some of the lower elevations in south central Alaska are melting out, getting some brown ground there, but otherwise there's a whole lot of white
Sure.
on the image. What areas are cloudy, but what areas are clear and covered by snow or ice?
Okay.
It turns out that if we leave the visible spectrum behind a little bit, see, a satellite has multiple channels in the electromagnetic spectrum that it can look at.
Oh, okay.
Part of that's visible light, what we
Right.
see as humans, but there's a lot going on at other wavelengths. If we add in something that's called near infrared, what we couldn't quite see, but we're getting into that infrared territory, there's a magical property that we can exploit.
Secrets to find. Okay.
Oh yeah, this is actually powerful and almost magical, that at a slightly longer wavelength, when the sun shines down on Alaska and then it bounces off back to the satellite, at that near infrared wavelength, it turns out that snow and ice will absorb that wavelength, but liquid water, like liquid droplets in a cloud, will reflect it back.
Okay.
And that's not the way it works in visible. You know, visible, it just bounces off of all those targets the same. But at near infrared, snow and ice absorbs it, and the liquid will reflect it back. Liquid cloud droplets will do that.
Okay.
And so an image where everything looks white suddenly becomes colorful.
Oh, okay.
And the way this recipe works is that the clouds look pink, and the snow-covered ground and the ice-covered ocean look blue. Suddenly now, we're able to see the polar bear in the snowstorm. We're able to see where the clouds are and where the snow is and where the ice is. This is a powerful advantage. Consider the case zooming into the Bering Strait area. What if you were asked to brief a pilot who wanted to fly, say, from Kotzebue down to Savunga or Gamble,
Right.
and had to fly VFR, visual flight rules, so they had to stay out of the clouds? Could you use a satellite image where everything is white to provide that pilot any guidance?
It'd be pretty tricky.
Very tricky. And that's why we have to go to this other recipe where the all-white polar bear in the snowstorm becomes more colorful. And now we can tell the pilot, aha, this is a cloud you want to stay out of, but over here, sure, it looks white in the visible spectrum,
Right.
but what we're doing, we'll show you, oh, this is just snow-covered ground, but it's clear, so you can fly right through there, visual flight rules. Same thing for a mariner who might want to get down to St. Lawrence Island, say, but it has to avoid the sea ice. This product has applicability there as well.
Wonderful.
It's an amazing new technology, so many new channels. The satellite that makes this imagery actually has 22 different channels that it looks at.
22 secret decoder rings.
22 secret decoder rings.
Okay. You know, I liken this to an activity I had in the car when I was growing up. We go on long car rides, and we do all the work in these activity books to, you know, stay calm, cool, and collected for our parents who were trying to get us across the state. But to get the answer, the real answer, you had to apply that red sheet to see the answer or the secret path or whatever the message was in that activity book to get you onto the next page. And it's also like a photography filter, right? If you're taking a lot of pictures, you can apply different colors to see different parts of that image. I mean, that sounds a lot like what you're talking about.
Oh, you know it. The information is in there all along. We just have to combine the channels in a way to reveal what's in there. And by the way, you're dating yourself. So you didn't have an iPad in the back of the car?
No, sir.
Okay. Well, we have, lastly, for dessert, there's a great image of the same kind of recipe. We're looking at South Central Alaska the first week of January. In first week of January, the sun, even at noon, is really low on the horizon, barely up. And in this image, the fun thing is the shadow of Denali. We can see the shadow of Denali over a lower pink cloud deck.
Yeah, that's amazing.
And Denali at 20,000 feet casts a big shadow. So this is another, just for fun, kind of application here. This is called multispectral satellite imagery, and it's the future. And happily, the future is now.
Oh, that is fascinating. And 22 different secrets that can be revealed from just one satellite tool that's floating overhead. Eric, thanks so much for joining us again. We can't wait to have you back and telling us more secrets of satellite technology that are passing over us every single day, many times a day, over Alaska and helping us all the way in many different parts of our lives. So thanks so much for joining us again.
Well, happy to be here.
All right. And thank you for staying with us. We'll be back with a little more weather here in just a few minutes. And of course, we'll have more Alaska weather facts anytime online.
And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Time for a quick check of your sea ice edge, and you can see that around the central and eastern Beaufort seacoast, the ice is really filling in fairly quickly here. We'll continue to see decent ice growth as long as the winds don't interrupt that, but sea surface temperatures are certainly cold enough here, and they're becoming cold enough across the Chukchi Coast, but we're really still lacking a lot of ice in this region, and really once the winds settle down, we should see some decent growth opportunities there. You'll also notice a little bit of new growth out around Macoriuk and Etoll and Strait up around the Yukon Delta. Any ice there is good news at this point because the winds are coming into this region, and throughout tonight, tomorrow, and through the weekend, we could have some pretty good pushes of wind and waves coming up ashore, especially into Kotzebue Sound and northward. Here's a look at what's going on in southeast. The winds have settled down a little bit, but still blustery around northern Lynn Canal and Skagway, 35 knots with a 7-foot sea. North and westerlies a little bit further south, and taming a little bit around Clarence Strait, 10 knots with a 2-foot sea. Northwesterlies south of Cross Sound, you're looking at 20 knots with 9 to 10-foot seas there, 15-knot winds up north. As we get into your Friday, notice the south and easterly flow switching around. Low pressure is moving in toward the outer coast, and with that we expect a mixture of rain and snow, rain mainly south and along Sitka, and first snow for the season in Juneau is possible with this. Watch for a southeasterly flow through the Stevens Passage region, northerlies in the Lynn Canal down to 25 knots with a 5-foot sea, and north and easterlies blowing offshore from Yakutat, 25 knots with 8-foot seas on Friday. For south central, northwesterlies inside of Prince William Sound, a 3-foot sea there, also looking for similar conditions in Cook Inlet with a northeasterly flow. Much stronger winds blowing across the Barren Islands, 40 to 45 with 12 to 13-foot seas expected. Westerlies outside of the Resurrection Bay area with 10-foot seas into the western Gulf. As we get into your Friday, notice northerlies take over just about all the region, 20 to 25 knot winds in the northern Gulf and Prince William Sound, 8-foot seas on the outside, 4-foot seas on the inside. Northerlies in Cook Inlet as well, producing 3 to 4-foot seas. And then there's that stronger northwesterly outflow crossing the Barrens, 15 to 18-foot seas with high gales, 40 to 45 knot winds expected on Friday. Northwesterlies across Bristol Bay at 30 knots on Thursday with a 9-foot sea, 10-foot seas a little bit further down the coast. Westerlies over Kodiak Island, 30 knots with 7 to 10-foot seas on either side, 9-foot seas down the Pacific coastline through Sand Point, 20 to 25 knot winds. The winds are going to pick up a little bit more as we get into your Friday with a northwesterly flow crossing Kodiak Island, 35 to 40 knots. And we're getting into gales there just south and west of AKwx all the way down towards Sand Point. A little bit of a lighter flow, 8 to 12-foot seas on the Pacific side and 8 to 9-foot seas across the Bering Sea coast into Bristol Bay with that northwesterly flow continuing. For the Aleutians, 15 to 30 knot winds out west. High pressure is in control here, so lighter winds in the central regions and then back into that northwesterly flow for the east. 20 knot winds there from the north and west, 8 to 10-foot seas expected as high pressure shifts eastward a little bit more. The return flow out west starts to pick up a little bit more, 25 to 35 knots with 10 to 13-foot seas. Still looking at generally light winds and small seas for the central and eastern chain on Friday. For the west coast now, a lot of wind from here on out. Westerlies coming into the YK Delta and Norton Sound, 30 knots due west with 8 to 13-foot seas there, 10-foot seas around St. Paul and St. George with a northwesterly flow. On Friday, you can see the winds slowing just a little bit, but not much. 25 to 30 knots in most areas, and you'll notice slightly larger seas out across the west. That's coming your way for Saturday. Westerlies coming into Norton Sound, 20 knots with a 5-foot sea there on Friday. For Thursday, across the Chukchi Seacoast, 25 knots to as high as 30 knots down around the Bering Strait region. 13-foot seas expected with a westerly flow around Wainwright Point layup toward Barrow. Southwesterlies at 25 knots with an 8-foot sea. And we're now showing ice north of Kaktovik with a 15-knot wind from the south. 5-foot seas north of Prudhoe Bay. 20 knots there coming in from the south and west. As we get into Friday, the winds stay strong and are blowing right in from the west across the Chukchi coast. 25 to 30 knots in some cases, 9 to 12-foot seas expected, and some of that will cause additional run-up on the coastline. So be prepared for coastal flooding. A coastal flood watch is out for many locations, and a high surf advisory continues this evening before we start watching for that next wave of weather. Here's a look at the weather map one more time tonight. Low pressure is moving through tonight, bringing another round of snow. Winter storm warning still in effect for the Kobuk and Noatak valleys there. Could see as much as a foot of snow or more as this system is passing through. Snow will spread eastward as well, and many other locations will have poor visibility thanks to blowing snow, including some of our mountain passes. As we get into Thursday and Friday, we're watching for the next weather maker out west to develop. This will be Saturday, Sunday, and Monday's weather maker as it moves into northwestern Alaska. So a very active period of weather and winter continues for north and western Alaska. This weather maker here drops south and east and into southeastern Alaska, perhaps producing the first snow for Juneau this season.
These forecasts are to be used for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating. Alaska Weather is made possible by the following sponsors.
The National Weather Service.